This is Fearful Frequencies. This story is called Echoes of the Ancients. The Great Pyramid loomed over the desert like a timeless sentinel, its weathered limestone blocks glowing faintly under the pale light of dawn. For centuries, its secrets had been debated, speculated upon, and dismissed as legend. But now, Dr. Elias Carter stood at the base of the ancient structure, staring at the excavation site that had already begun to unearth strange truths. Around him, a team of 20 researchers, engineers, and technicians worked in hushed efficiency, their movements almost reverent. It was an unassuming fissure in the stonework that had sparked the expedition. A chance discovery by a tourist, an almost imperceptible seam running vertically along one of the pyramid's massive stones, had been dismissed as unimportant until ground-penetrating radar detected an empty void beyond it. Elias had spent sleepless nights poring over the anomaly data. The void was no ordinary chamber. Its dimensions and positioning defied explanation. It was geometrically perfect and seemed completely isolated from the rest of the known passages. That was when the backers of this expedition stepped in. Elias had never met the mysterious investor funding their work, but the funding came with peculiar stipulations. Any artifacts recovered were to be documented but not disclosed publicly until thoroughly analyzed. The team was to report their findings daily to a secured channel, and no external communication was allowed under penalty of termination. Elias suspected there was far more to the investor's interest than academic curiosity, but the potential discovery was too significant to refuse. As the excavation began, a sense of unease settled over the camp. The first signs of strangeness were subtle: tools misplaced, equipment malfunctioning for no discernible reason, and a faint, low-frequency hum that several team members swore they could feel in their bones. The archaeologists dismissed it as stress or coincidence, but the incidents began to stack up. On the third day, a technician named Ryan swore he heard faint whispers coming from deep within the fissure as he installed monitoring equipment. It wasn't wind, he insisted at dinner that night. It was voices. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. The others laughed nervously, but Ryan wasn't the only one to notice something off. By the fifth day, the fissure had been carefully widened into an accessible passage. A team led by Dr. Anika Patel entered the opening to perform initial surveys. The tunnel was narrower than expected, forcing them to move single file. It spiraled downward, the walls carved with strange patterns that Elias had never seen before. They were geometric yet organic, their curves and angles seeming to shift under the flicker of their flashlights. It's not hieroglyphics, Anika murmured, running her fingers over the grooves. It doesn't resemble any known Egyptian script. The deeper they went, the more the temperature dropped. The air grew heavier, and a faint metallic tang filled their nostrils. The tunnel seemed endless, as though they were descending into the earth itself rather than a structure. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the spiral ended, opening into a small chamber. Elias entered last, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The chamber's walls were smoother than the rough stone of the tunnel, almost polished, and were lined with patterns similar to those in the corridor. But here, the designs were interrupted by small, crystalline nodes embedded in the walls. They seemed to hum faintly, vibrating just enough to set Elias's teeth on edge. "What do you think these are?" Anika asked, shining her light on one of the nodes. "I don't know," Elias admitted. "They almost look like conduits." "For what?" Anika whispered. Elias had no answer. Instead, he focused on a low pedestal in the center of the chamber. Atop it rested a strange metallic object, roughly the size of a loaf of bread and shaped like an elongated octagon. It was seamless, as though it had been carved from a single block of metal, and it gave off a faint, almost imperceptible glow. "Don't touch it," Elias warned as Anika moved closer. "We need to document everything first." As they examined the chamber, strange phenomena began to occur. Ryan's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. "Damn it," he muttered, smacking the side of the device. "Here, take mine," Annika offered, but her voice sounded strange, distorted, as though she were speaking underwater. Elias turned toward her, confused. "What did you say?" "I didn't—" She stopped, her eyes widening as the hum in the room grew louder. The nodes embedded in the walls began to pulse faintly, their glow matching the rhythmic vibration of the air. The team froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Is it some kind of resonance effect?" Ryan asked, his voice tight. "Maybe," Elias said, though he didn't believe it. The hum wasn't mechanical. It was deeper, almost alive, and it seemed to respond to their presence. "Let's get out of here," Annika said abruptly, her voice shaky. "This isn't right." As they made their way back up the tunnel, the sense of unease deepened. The walls seemed closer than before, the patterns on them more pronounced, as though they were shifting in the periphery of their vision. And then came the sound, a faint, distant scraping, like stone against stone, echoing up the passageway. "Did you hear that?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, his pulse quickening. He quickened his pace, urging the others to do the same. Whatever was in that chamber, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. When they finally emerged into the sunlight, the team was silent. The warmth of the desert air should have been a comfort after the oppressive chill of the tunnel, but instead, it felt like a mockery. Elias turned to Annika, whose face was pale. "We need to catalog everything we've seen," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He wasn't sure how to explain what had just happened. Over the next 2 days, the team tried to focus on their work, but a strange tension hung over the camp. People became irritable, snapping at each other over trivial matters. Ryan, usually the most laid back of the group, had become withdrawn. He spent hours sitting outside his tent, staring at the pyramid as though it were staring back at him. Elias couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the patterns from the walls, their shapes twisting and folding in ways that made his head throb. He wasn't the only one. Annika confessed over breakfast that she had been having vivid nightmares, dreams of being buried alive in the pyramid, the walls closing in around her. By the third night, things took a darker turn. The camp was quiet, most of the team asleep, when Elias heard it. A low, rhythmic pounding, like the beat of a massive drum. He sat up in his cot, his heart racing. The sound was coming from the pyramid. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, finding Annika and Ryan already awake. "You hear it too?" Annika asked, her voice shaking. Elias nodded. "It's coming from inside." The three of them walked cautiously toward the excavation site, the pounding growing louder with each step. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, like a signal. When they reached the opening, Elias hesitated. "We shouldn't go back in there," he said, but even as he spoke, he knew they would. The sound was drawing them, compelling them to uncover its source. The tunnel was darker than before, the air colder. The hum they had felt earlier was gone, replaced by an eerie silence between each pulse of the pounding. As they descended, the light from their flashlights seemed weaker, the beams swallowed by the darkness ahead. When they reached the chamber, they found it changed. The crystalline nodes embedded in the walls were now glowing brightly, their light casting sharp, angular shadows across the room. The object on the pedestal was vibrating, its glow pulsating in time with the pounding. But it wasn't the only thing in the chamber. At first, Elias thought it was a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it clearly. A figure stood at the far end of the room, its body elongated and angular, as though it had been sculpted from shadow. It didn't move, but Elias could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating. "Is that—" Annika began, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure stepped forward, and the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against their eardrums. Elias couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And then it spoke, The voice was not a sound, but a presence, a vibration that resonated in their bones. It was a language they couldn't understand, yet the meaning was clear. You do not belong here. Continued in part 2,